Hi, and welcome back to our lecture here on early Japan in world history. In part one, we talked about the geography of Japan, and we talked a little bit about their early culture. And we're going to continue looking at their culture here, as well as talking about feudalism, which is what your constructive response question was all about. So, looking at Japanese culture, we mentioned a little bit about their religion and Shinto in the previous video. But Buddhism actually travels across the sea and does take hold a little bit in Japan. So Korean travelers brought Buddhism from Korea. It had traveled from India across China over to Korea and eventually made its way over to Japan. And it was officially accepted by the Japanese imperial court in the mid-700s. So Buddhism spread, but the Japanese never abandoned Shinto. In fact, what you see is sort of a combination. So there were some Buddhist rituals that became Shinto rituals, and some Shinto gods and goddesses were worshipped in Buddhist temples. So you sort of see a blending of them. Now, this does not apply to all the Japanese today, but you will see elements of this in the Japanese culture. So more so than some of the other religions we've looked at, Buddhism has a foundation in Japanese culture. Now, we talked about how the Japanese borrowed from China. So interest in Buddhist ideas grew into enthusiasm for all things Chinese. In fact, it was this guy here, Prince Shotoku, who really got interested in what the Chinese had to offer. So Prince Shotoku, who was a Buddhist convert, sent first of the three missions over to China. And really the whole goal of these missions was to study Chinese civilization, kind of look and say, hey, what are the Chinese doing? What can we learn from them? What can we bring back here that we can benefit off of? And cultures do this all the time. We may see somebody doing something with technology where you have a different company that adopts that idea or essentially copies it. That's why we have trademarks and patents today, to make sure that people don't benefit off of other people's ideas. But we're always borrowing. That's just been a regular thing throughout human history. So there's no doubt the Chinese were certainly looked to by the Japanese in terms of their culture. So the Japanese adopted all sorts of different Chinese ideas. They took their style of writing. They've made it their own, but it's very similar. They've taken a lot of their art, landscape paintings, cooking. Both of the cultures drink a lot of tea and eat a lot of rice. Even the civil service system that was a Confucius idea in China was adopted in Japan. Now, it failed in Japan. It didn't take hold there, but they did at least try it. So here we have a whole bunch of different ideas that the Chinese came up with that were later adopted, or at least attempted to be adopted, by the Japanese. The last part of this story is to talk about Japanese feudalism. And feudalism is an interesting thing because really what it is it's a political hierarchy and how the countryside is run politically. So eventually central power would be challenged by great landowners and clan chiefs. Well, those landowners acted as more independent rulers, and they started setting up their own private armies. This basically leads to small pockets of power all across the country, rather than having one strong leader at the center who runs everything. They still had an emperor, but that didn't mean the emperor was a strong leader. A lot of times in Japanese history, these emperors were revered and worshipped, but other people made a lot of the decisions, and a lot of the power rested within these landowners. So small landowners traded parts of their land to strong warlords for protection, which began the feudal system, or feudalism, in Japan. So this is where we're going to talk about some of our vocab words. We're going to bring in some new roles here, including the daimyos, who are those strong warlords, and the samurai, who helped protect them. So feudalism itself is a period of Japanese history where the country was dominated by powerful regional families called daimyos, and ruled militarily by the shogun. Well, we have to acknowledge at the top of their social pyramid, which I will show you on the next slide, by the way, was the emperors. The emperor was the figurehead at the top of Japanese society. Oftentimes this emperor could make decisions, but not all of them were strong rulers. It's not like a dictator or a pharaoh that had total control, because that's not the case here in feudalism. Below the emperor was the shogun. So the shogun was the supreme general of the emperor's army, and oftentimes that shogun had powers of a military dictator and could really become the real power of Japan. If you have the military behind you, you can be very, very powerful. Below the shogun were those daimyos that we mentioned above. So they're landowners. Think of daimyos as landowners. They surrounded themselves with loyal bodyguards called samurai. They didn't want anybody taking their land. They didn't want anybody taking their stuff. So you essentially have these loyal bodyguards called samurai that are there to protect you and your lands. So here's just another look at this social pyramid. So you have the emperor at the top, then you have the shogun, which is your military leader. Then you have daimyos, these landowners, and they hired samurai to protect them. At the bottom, you have your peasants, artisans, and merchants. What you don't see here is slaves, which is very unique. But in the middle, you have ronin. And we're going to talk about something called ritualistic suicide, called seppuku, that the samurai could use to regain their honor. The ronin were those who chose not to commit seppuku upon the death of his master. So we won't focus on the ronin, but I at least want to point them out, as that might be the one term on here that's confusing to some people. So samurai are awesome. I mean, their whole lives were dedicated to protecting, to fighting, to training, and to discipline. Samurai were never offensive weapons. They were never invading armies. They were there to protect people, which is a very honorable thing. So samurai lived by a demanding behavior code called Bushido, which is also known as the way of the warrior. So samurai were expected to show reckless courage and die an honorable death. They did not look forward to retirement. They weren't people that said, hey, I can't wait to retire on the farm and play with the grandkids. It was a part of their culture to want to die in battle. Now, that didn't mean they ran out in the middle of the battlefield and said, kill me! But the idea was that, if you were mortally wounded on the battlefield, protecting the person you were meant to protect, that was a way more honorable thing than living out a long life. So that's a really unique piece of Japanese culture there. Now, if dishonored, samurai could earn their honor back by committing seppuku, which was a ritualistic suicide. Samurai always carried two swords with them. They had their katana, which was their fighting weapon. Some call it the samurai soul. But they also had a short sword called a wakizashi. And you could take the wakizashi and essentially ritualistically rip open your belly and bleed out and die. And that's bizarre. That's not something you see in many cultures, but it was meant to regain your honor if the person you were protecting had been killed or you had failed your mission. Eventually, under Emperor Meiji in the late 1860s, Japan began modernizing, which rendered the samurai obsolete, and they were forced out of Japanese culture. Again, in my history through film class at Elk River High School, we focus a little bit more on that, and we watched the film The Last Samurai to get an understanding of how the Japanese culture really forced out these wonderful bodyguards and really ended this unique part of Japanese culture. So I recommend taking that class. So that brings us to the end. The result here, our summation, is the Japanese culture borrowed heavily from their Chinese neighbors and established a culture that is very remarkable on its own, which included Shinto and a unique form of governing called feudalism, which included the samurai as loyal bodyguards. So if we come back to our constructive response questions, as describe feudalism in Japan, and specifically how the samurai were a part of it, we looked at the social pyramid, we defined feudalism, and we had definitely several facts about the samurai that we can use to really flesh out and fill out this answer here. So everything you need is right embedded in this video. So that's going to do it for us here today. I hope you learned something. We'll see you next time.